What I want to do today is talk about the incredible community response to the COVID-19 crisis, lockdown, pandemic. Um, this is the first of two sessions I want to do connected to community leadership. The second, I'm going to focus on the voluntary and community sector, civil society sector, link that in with local government and use Newham as a sort of case of looking at that. Today I wanted to just look at some of the community response to the crisis. Um, I think what we can say is there's been quite an incredible response from informal community groups. This is the point I want to make in this slide. This is what we call mutual aid. It's about communities getting together to help each other. The photo is of my Nunhead Knox, covering Peckham and Nunhead. And I think the point to make about them, I mean, there's probably about 3,500, and this is minimum, because these are the mutual aid groups that are connected or have been have notified a sort of umbrella website, which is been set up to help people find their local COVID-19 support group. And of course, these support groups are sort of, now overlapping with what the NHS responders doing, but they were immediately helping people who are isolated by chatting to them, getting provisions, in some cases prescriptions, driving to deliver goods, and I think the interesting part of it is what it means in terms of community leadership and the way in which people respond very quickly to these kinds of crises, even though I say these kinds of crises as an unprecedented crisis. So one is that it's bottom up. This is community generated. This is not top down. It's not government controlled. It's not even been coordinated by any kind of charity or charity body. It's a very good example of spontaneous, emergent community leadership. We might call it collective community leadership. The advantage of these mutual aid groups is that they are quick. Now, what I'm going to touch on later is one of the problems when, although it's fantastic, you get these 750,000 people volunteering for the NHS. It takes time. Lots of people are not hearing anything, even though they've registered to volunteer. One of the interesting things about the COVID-19 mutual aid groups is how quick they were to emerge. So, for example, the Nunhead Knox example I've got there, that was up and running before the lockdown was announced. So it can be very quick, these kinds of things. They're informal. There's no voluntary organisation directing it. It's a couple of residents. I think one of the residents has been stood for the Green Party in politics. But you wouldn't know that, and that's in a way what I wanted to stress there is that this relies on both it being informal and collective. There has to be something in which lots of people get involved, and of course the other point about it is that it's local, so it's within a bounded area. This is Nunhead and Peckham, which is feasible for a kind of informal, collective mutual aid type network to operate in. And with the other thing about these mutual aid groups is how much they harness technology. So a lot of it is done on these apps like WhatsApp, Zoom, so that if people are self-isolating, they can still help out by doing things like coordinating visits, phone calls, etc. As well as that, we have this incredible and, as we'll see, unprecedented peacetime mobilisation of volunteers. So that 750,000 registered for the NHS responders. That was 3 times more than the government were expecting. And after a slow start, some of those volunteers are now actually up and running. And in a sense, they overlap with and are supplementary to what's been going on already. Of course, they have the kind of resources and central direction and funding which makes it easier to run a more coordinated national response. But there are disadvantages of that because you lose the kind of sense of speed and connectedness and locality. In addition, you have 250,000 people registered to volunteer with local and frontline organisations. Now, all of the sources I'm using here, I put in one big slide at the end of the presentation. But this is just from the one of the umbrella bodies, NCBO, who produced this data. Now, that's minimum, because that's only those who registered with those organisations. So that's effectively 1 million volunteers, 1 million formal volunteers, because they're volunteering through an organisation. They have to apply, they have to show identity, there might be some DBS checks, particularly for certain of those roles. So it's what we call formal volunteering. And it's been called the largest peacetime mobilisation in UK history, and I was involved in a very interesting email thread by some academics who form part of the voluntary sector network, and they were saying this is probably unprecedented. I mean, just to put it in perspective, formally 70,000 people volunteered for the London Olympics, although some research has been slightly sceptical of that figure, saying it might be more like 45,000. In the 50s, there was a civil defence service, which was mostly about volunteers who would be activated if there was a nuclear war, and some of those were then used when there were natural disasters or emergencies like floods. But this is, as far as the records show, the largest peacetime mobilisation. If we want a wartime one, and not including the army, which of course is not voluntary but compulsory, you would have the 1 million women who volunteered in the Women's Volunteer Service, or the Wrens as they became known, in the Second World War, but this certainly in peacetime. You also get this kind of upsurge of these very informal, fantastic networks, which don't get picked up by the media for a while, who are effectively coordinating voluntarily. They're making PPE equipment and scrubs for NHS workers, and what they're actually doing is doing that, helping, giving those things to individual doctors, workers, key workers, so that they don't so the speed of which that means they don't have to go through these formal mechanisms. Of course, this does connect to one of the problems about the crisis, which is why on earth aren't the NHS workers being provided with sufficient equipment? And to some degree, this volunteer-led initiative both sort of disguises that, and you could argue possibly detracts from that core issue. But nonetheless, all these fantastic initiatives are taking place. So we then have sort of the examples of community giving, which is people actually donating money. I picked out 3 just because I think they're kind of interesting for what they show. Some of you may have watched just a couple of nights ago the Big Night In, hosted by Comic Relief and Children in Need, and sort of amalgamating the yearly fundraiser that takes place on the BBC. There's a list of charities. They're all frontline organisations. Some are homelessness, some are about care homes, some of the NHS charities together. They raised 26 million on that night, and the government promised to double that. So effectively, that's about 100 million. But the 26 million is also exactly the same amount of money that Captain Tom Moore fundraised for via the Just Giving app, doing 100 laps of his garden for his 100th birthday. And there he is. And of course, that's received an awful lot of publicity. I think one of the interesting things about the giving is that there can be these quite quirky, eccentric, idiosyncratic types of examples of volunteering. For example, the Boy Scouts with Bear Grylls have basically, I think it's 240,000 miles to the moon, and I think 240,000 scouts have each walked a mile in some way to represent that figure. It's a kind of nice idea. It makes sense to people, and it's very popular. The 2.6 challenge, which is what's in fact that's tomorrow to replace the London Marathon, is encouraging people to run, walk, do some exercise. And the 2.6 is the idea that if 2.6 million people each raise £26, that will raise £67 million for charities. And the strange thing about this situation, and this is what I'm going to talk about in the second part of this series, is the fact that while there's huge amounts of money pouring into civil society and charities, at the same time, charities are having a huge loss and drop of income at the very time when they're most needed. And we'll talk about that a bit the next time. So, I mean, some of the success factors about this type of community giving and drawing on this resource is a combination of things which kind of work well anyway in fundraising. I mean, obviously, you've got the massive TV issue in terms of these big fundraisers, the Big Night In could harness. With Tom Moore and others, you've got the fact that these digital fundraising platforms, Just Giving Money and Virgin Money Giving being two of the most well known, who have either cut or stopped the online charge. And these are, again, very quick ways which can be distributed and shared on social media, which enable people to volunteer for a range of different ideas, initiatives by individuals, and not just have to give via the usual channels. Obviously, a huge amount of celebrities involved in the Big Night In, and various others, in fact. I've just seen the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince of Wales Trust harnessing some musicians. Obviously, the power of celebrity is very, very crucial in terms of mobilising large amounts of money. Captain Moore is the kind of sort of, you can't imagine a more sort of reputable figure. There he is. He's old, but he's also a hero. Look, he's got his war medals on there, and in a way, no one can really take offence at that. He can't be a divisive figure. He's emblematic of Britain's past and Britain's present, I think, wrapped up into one feel-good story. Yeah, these kind of community giving things can be very quirky and eccentric, but they help people to feel good. They give people a human interest story, which is actually making a social contribution. I think that's quite important. Now, obviously, what we haven't touched on is why all these initiatives are happening. And I'm certainly not going to get involved in the kind of numbers of infections and deaths, only indirectly via the issue about BAME numbers. But in addition to the actual sickness and self and isolation, we have some particular problems. I said, and I've put some, as in this is by no means definitive. Now, care homes and PPE and getting equipment is one of the issues that, because I'm privy to to Newham Council and the Newham voluntary sector's coordinated efforts and seeing what's happening there. That's clearly one of the major issues, certainly in Newham, and of course I think from news stories this has been an issue wider on. Some of the other issues are about hunger or food shortage. So it was estimated that in early April there was one day when 1.5 million people went a whole day without food. Now that's not necessarily that they can't afford food, but that was about unaffordability plus lack of access. But that's a substantial figure. And of course food banks are also trying to keep donations going, even when people can no longer just drop in, and they're having to do essentially what the NHS responders are doing, and do a lot of this by car. One of the other issues which has been well flagged up in the media is the amount of the uptake in people calling domestic abuse helplines, reporting domestic abuse. Obviously, the intensity of lockdown is kind of powder keg for these kinds of issues, and there's been, that's one of the downsides. Of course, one of the other highly reported negative aspects has been about disproportionate numbers of BAME deaths. I think it's something like 33% of infections of being BAME individuals. That's set against a 13% BAME population in the whole UK. So it's disproportionate. And this, of course, has caused lots and lots of debate. Some of it is about, why is that happening? On the one hand, you have issues about inequality and people perceive as racial discrimination, where BAME individuals are generally living in poorer areas, more crowded housing. But equally, they're disproportionately recruited in public sector, so they're more likely to be key workers. And of course, in cities, which particularly London, which has seen the largest number of deaths, the BAME population is more like 40% in lots of those places. So there are lots of issues, but obviously this is now something that Labour, particularly in terms of political parties, are pushing. If you want to look at more of that, Charity So White has got some of the has been doing some work on this, and I'm going to talk about them as well in the next session. One of the interesting things that's happened is that the Office of National Statistics, who do most of the kind of surveys about population perceptions They do lots of studies about community. They do the Wellbeing Index. They released some data last week about some of the community perceptions about lockdown and what's happening. And unsurprisingly, 85% of adults who they interviewed were worried about coronavirus. What were they worried about? Well, over half the people who were phoned reported negative well-being. I'm not quite sure why boredom is being thrown into that, because it's something that's maybe possibly quite different to the sort of more potentially dangerous issues about stress, anxiety and depression. But perhaps that's certainly not surprising. That set against normally you only see about 3 to 5% of people saying they have high levels of anxiety. Now, those are obviously quite concerning. At the same time, this is one of the other things that the ONS survey picked out. Has there been this kind of resurgence of community spirit? Well, people themselves seem to think so. So in terms of the people who were interviewed in this survey, almost two-thirds of them thought that they believed that others were doing more to help others since the coronavirus outbreak, i.e. they believed that there was an upsurge in community togetherness, people doing things for each other. And equally, a similar proportion said that they now believed that other community members would support them if they needed help. And that's quite an interesting symmetry of a proportion. It's kind of similar numbers who think that people are helping and those who think that in terms of what their expectations are that people will help. And one of the other things that was reported, of course, we're relying on people telling the truth here when they do these surveys, is that over half of adults checked on neighbours who might need help at least once. So, what does this say about the country? I mean, I just want to sort of touch briefly on the significance of these kinds of data and the sociological points in terms of what it says about society and patterns. Well, there's three. I just very quickly thought about three things. One is about the idea of social capital being about the resource and value or currency even that is generated through positive social interaction. And particularly social capital is associated in community terms, associated with trust and believing in something called reciprocity, which is that if you help someone else, it generates the perception that you might get help back. So it's this sort of virtuous circle of people helping each other. And that's particularly involved in bonding social capital. That's something that people are concerned about. And one of the ways in which social capital has become a popular idea is this idea that we have lost in the UK and other Western countries a sense of community spirit. People are, the perception is that people are helping out each other less. And this feeds into another key sociological idea of the last few decades about this idea of an individualized society where people essentially have become cut off from particularly either traditional institutions like churches, trade unions, and in terms of wider support networks, and that we're all kind of insecure and individualized and self-interested, and that is encouraged by things like marketing and media. Well, I mean, I've always been slightly sceptical about that thesis in terms of it's very convenient in terms of the patterns of modern life, but actually people, as volunteering stats and giving would show, are remarkably helpful despite all these ideas. However, the other interesting idea that I wanted just to bring out is that this idea of communitas. Communitas is fleeting moments of community. In other words, what these kinds of events might demonstrate is that you get this incredible upsurge of community spirit, which lasts as long as the crisis or the particular event and then disappear afterwards. And a good example, although of course it's nothing like the scale of this, would be the London 2012 Olympics, when there was a sense in London of missing this kind of community spirit which came and then just came and went. It's a fleeting thing. Now, for all that the data and the initiatives and the projects being run and the mutual aid and giving and volunteering and all these things are fantastic, there have been some critical points raised. Now, these critical points are not found in any sourced information. This is just things I've picked up from academics discussing some of these issues online. One of the problems is that if you suddenly create a situation where a huge amount of money and volunteers get poured into a central organisation, you have what they call a disaster emergency problem, which is often that organisations who actually are hosting the money and the people are kind of overwhelmed, really. And usually what that means is that volunteers are left waiting and don't get contacted, which is one of the issues about the NHS responder scheme. And that the money is so much that people don't spend it wisely, because actually what people want to see is that the money is being spent. And I mean, one of the interesting things I found is that I volunteered both for my mutual aid group, and then when I didn't hear anything back from them, from my from the local food bank at Pecan in Peckham, I've not heard from either of those organisations, and that's 2-3 weeks ago. So that's it is indicative of one of the problems about money and volunteers suddenly pouring into organisation institutions who aren't used to it, and we see it with this kind of the idea about crashing websites, which happens. Now, the other issue, which is a political point, is the idea that it's absolutely fantastic that people are doing so much for the NHS, not just in terms of donating to care homes and various aspects of it, clapping every Thursday, but actually it is a public service that people pay for in their taxes and should be seen as such, rather than something that the community is responsible for. And this, again, connects to this idea of what one of my colleagues called misguided philanthropy, which is that it's very convenient for governments who have spent years cutting and privatising aspects of the NHS to suddenly have this absolute huge groundswell of support for the NHS, which may have a wonderful impact in some ways, but might lead people to the impression that the NHS needs to be funded by volunteers and people giving, whereas, of course, it's a core public service that we pay for. However, I think that that's probably a fairly extreme idea in some regards, and in terms of the fact that the NHS has always kind of worked in tandem with volunteering and voluntary agencies, plus the fact that it will be a very foolish politician, certainly at the moment, to think about cutting the NHS, although issues about privatisation are important and cuts, but they are not something I'm going to go into huge amounts here. So I've just tried to give a brief overview and some critical analysis about the community response. And in the next session, I'm going to move on to the sector, the voluntary community sector, community activists, and some of the issues about the funding, some of the government support, and I'm going to look at that next time. So thank you very much for listening.